Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and I'm in Toronto, and I'm going to go, I think, to New York City to visit Cora Weiss, because it's time for me to get acquainted with Cora Weiss. Cora, I've known about for 40 years, maybe. Cora has been one of the great stalwarts in the world peace movement for as long as I can remember.
Because I was very kind of you.
Well, it's true, because back during the Vietnam War days, I was hearing your name as a leader. You were doing demonstrations. You were meeting with, I think, Vietnamese women or something, and then you became much more famous for your work with the women peace groups, peace activists, and so on. And just before I was on the steering committee of the International Peace Bureau, you had been one of the presidents of the International Peace Bureau.
I was the president. We had only one. Yeah.
I wondered about that because I was looking it up. Normally, you see, the International Peace Bureau has a system with co-presidents, one woman and one man at a time. Their terms of office sort of don't start and end at the same time, but there's a kind of an overlapping kind of
arrangement. I was president from 2000 to 2006.
Okay. Well, I want to cover all of that because kind of you can give me a good overview of the history of the peace movement and the many, many years that I've been engaged with it, and when you were much more prominent. So let's start back during the Vietnamese War and bring me up, give me an overview of what was going on. I think you were involved with William Sloane Coffin, if I recall correctly. Is that right?
That's right. He was the famous minister of the Riverside Church, and he hired me, although I eventually worked for nothing. He hired me to run the disarmament program, which was the only church in America that had one.
Amazing. Yes, and there were all kinds of meetings going on there. That was kind of the center, the crucible of the disarmament movement in those days. When did all that begin? Let's see, I was actually in Toronto and at Harvard during part of that time, and I came to Toronto, and I was in Berkeley more of the time. I came to Toronto in 1971, but the war was about to wind down by then.
No, not yet. My goodness. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, okay, you're right.
4 years of war.
But we'd already had a good part of the war by the time I got to Toronto, and I remember being tear gassed in Berkeley and so on. So let's go back to the earliest phases when you became involved.
I was a member of Women's Strike for Peace, among the national leaders, I guess you could say, and we were engaged in disarmament work for years, since 1961. And then the Vietnam War broke out and we split. Most of us wanted to go and start working against the war in Vietnam because we didn't think it was legal, moral, or necessary, or right. And some of the others of us wanted to maintain the disarmament program. So eventually, we merged the two splinters of Women's Strike for Peace. And what we did first has to do with your country of Canada. On July 4th, 1969, Voice of Women, VOW Canada, invited Women's Strike for Peace to come on our most sacred holiday, July 4th, to meet with Vietnamese women, some of whom had walked to Hanoi from the south. And they had flown to Canada, which let them in. But of course, the United States wouldn't let them in to our country. So we had to go to Canada. And the Voice of Women invited us. And we sat licking ice cream cones on a farm just near Toronto, actually. And the Vietnamese women said to me, would you put together a group of 3 women and come to visit our country? And that's how it started.
Mm.
And I said we couldn't go until after November 15, 1969, because that was going to be the day of the big mobilization against the war, with a demonstration in Washington. So as soon as that huge demonstration was over, it was one of 2. There was a moratorium demonstration on October 15 and our mobilization demonstration on November 15. They're making a movie about those 2 demonstrations right now.
You said this was 69?
1969.
Okay.
And as soon as our demonstration was over, November 15, I put together a woman from California and a woman from Pennsylvania, who was the president of Women's Strike for Peace at the time. And we took off for Hanoi. But before we left, I met with a group of half a dozen people who said, it's time for us to take the prisoner of war issue away from the president. We were fighting the war at that point because of, quote, the torture of prisoners of war. And our position was there would continue to be prisoners of war as long as there was bombing, because they shot down the planes and took the pilots and others in the plane prisoner.
Mm-hmm.
So a Quaker, Stuart Meacham, drafted a memo that I was going to carry to the Vietnamese women, because during the war, you couldn't negotiate with the government. We had a law that would send me to jail forever if I had done that. So in a communist country, the women's union was the closest thing that we could find to civil society, organized civil society. So I brought this memo to the women, and what it said was, if you would agree to let the pilots who were prisoners of war, and they were called detained in those days because the word prisoner of war was a legal term which the Vietnamese didn't recognize. If you would agree to have them each write a letter home once a month, we will bring mail from their families to them every month. And that was a pretty interesting and unique offer that we were making, and they agreed immediately. Not only could we bring mail every month, but I was invited to send 3 Americans every month to visit Vietnam, carrying mail to the prisoners of war. And we created an organization called the Committee of Liaison. We brought mail with us on that trip. And we got through over 300 letters to take home. And that was the first time such a large number of letters, which would indicate who was alive in the Vietnamese camps. And this was
sorry, there was no other official tally of who was in prison.
Never.
Oh.
The American government never knew who actually was in the camps until we got mail from them. Until then, a few people from the peace movement went and met with a few of the prisoners of war, but it wasn't on an organized basis, and they would bring home a few letters. So we created an organization called the Committee of Liaison. It had 2 purposes. One was to be a channel for mail going and bringing back, so that the mail would not have to go through intervention by any of the intelligence agencies and be censored. And we also were able to negotiate. I use the word gently because we didn't negotiate. We just suggested an improvement of packages for the prisoners of war so they could get more than shaving cream and toothpaste, so to speak. We came back with a list of some of the pilots who had been either killed or died as a result of their parachuting down. This was unique in wartime. First of all, I was called a housewife from the Bronx. So no housewife from any place had ever succeeded in achieving this kind of remarkable mission with the so-called enemy. And it was all done thanks to the Vietnam Women's Union and the women of Women's Strike for Peace.
That's wonderful. And they already, before you even met them, they already had some authorization. You knew that they had a clearance to make deals.
No, I don't think that could be said.
No,
they had nothing because they never knew what to expect.
I see.
So this was a big surprise. And they had authority to invite me to come to Vietnam and to bring 2 other women. So we went at the end of November.
How did you get there? Did you go through Japan or what?
No, we went from New York to Copenhagen on SAS, Scandinavian Airlines. And Copenhagen to Moscow, Moscow to Bangkok, and Bangkok, no, not Bangkok, the capital of Cambodia, Phnom Penh. And Phnom Penh, we got onto a very small plane, Poland and 2 other countries that would fly in and out of North Vietnam a couple of times a week. And when they decided to fly, there was an understanding that there would be no shooting from the ground. All fire was canceled. No bombing from the sky and no shooting from the ground, so that we could fly in safely. And so from Phnom Penh, we flew to Hanoi. And when we got to Hanoi, the bombing started immediately because we were down on the ground and they didn't have to hold their bombs anymore. And so the first thing we did when we got to Vietnam was to not carried, but raced down underground to an underground fallout shelter.
So they were bombing Hanoi too?
Not yet. Hanoi got bombed at Christmas. In response by Kissinger, in response to the peace trip that we made in September of 72. This was 1969.
Why did they have to get you underground if there was no real bombing? Were they afraid of that they would be bombed while you were there?
I guess so.
Huh.
Well, I should take that back. There was bombing. But I think the bombing that I'm thinking of was massive, of Haiphong Harbor and Hanoi in December of 72. That was huge. Yes, of course there was bombing because that's why the pilots were shot down. Anyway, it was Vietnamese women, American women, and civil society women. And I'll never forget it because I fell in love with organized civil society. And it was unique. It had never happened before in wartime. And eventually we went in August of 1972 with another delegation and brought home 3 American prisoners of war. Oh. And that was unique. And that was the front page of the New York Daily News.
Was it an exchange or, well, there wasn't?
No, peace gesture. And Peter Arnett came with us, the famous journalist. And Bill Coffin came with us, the famous American minister,
Mhm.
Reverend William Sloane Coffin. So we had and David Dellinger and myself and Richard Falk, who was an international lawyer.
Mhm.
So we had a lawyer and a minister and a journalist.
Yeah.
We met with the prime minister, we met with the minister of women, and we always met with officials, but that's the way they ran things. But we also met with people who were victims, people whose relatives were victims, people who wanted very much to be friends with us, with American.
Mhm.
The trip in 1972 was also unique, but in response to this great peace gesture, Mr. Kissinger did what they called the Christmas bombing of Haiphong Harbor and Hanoi. We used to send 3 Americans every month to Vietnam to carry mail and to bring mail back
Mhm.
and to be eyewitnesses to the war.
Mhm.
And in December, Joan Baez was there, and she had such courage. She went out on the balcony of her hotel during the bombing and sang
My God.
songs. It was just incredible.
Mm.
Anyway, that war was started because of a lie, and the Afghan invasion was started because of lies. And we've got to stop lying, and we've got to stop making war, and war as an institution has got to go. It doesn't succeed in achieving anything except destruction, death, deficit. It's just doesn't work.
Well, this is the week to talk about it because I think for some people, the penny is dropping. They hear, oh, yes, we lost in Vietnam. We lost in Afghanistan. We've lost everywhere. We've been in trouble. Maybe we better think something different. I've seen 3 or 4 pieces to that effect in places that I wouldn't normally expect to see that argument at all, just right now.
President Biden, in his speech a day or 2 ago, said, military isn't working. We need to use diplomacy. And I couldn't believe it. That was the greatest thing I've heard from an American president in years. I hope he remembers that he said it, because it's absolutely true. We should be teaching diplomacy in high school, in college, everywhere, in the communities. I was considered a citizen diplomat. It was sort of the first time, I think, that phrase had been used. And that's what we need. We need citizen diplomats to go to Afghanistan, to sit down with the Taliban. It's not going to be easy, but we've demonstrated that boots on the ground, which mean military boots, don't succeed. They don't achieve anything but death and destruction and debt.
Debt indeed. And the same with Iraq, it's one after another. The lessons are being demonstrated again and again.
There's an op-ed in the New York Times, I think yesterday or today, saying I went to Afghanistan on a lie. And it's written by a veteran. That's never happened before.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it'll catch on.
Now, what happened later? You didn't go home and bake cookies. This housewife from the Bronx kept up her activities. So what was your next development?
Well, the first thing I did was to create a new organization called Friendshipment, which was a play on words. And what we did was to organize some fundraising to help rebuild the Bach Mai Hospital in North Vietnam, which was a famous teaching hospital where people came from all over Asia to study. And that was pretty successful. We didn't have the millions that are needed to rebuild a hospital, but we raised a lot of money and we made a lot of new friends because we were doing humanitarian aid. That was the first thing that happened. And then, as I call it, a cascade of movements. One movement led into another movement. And I started to work with women. I've always worked with women. I worked with Women's Strike for Peace during the Vietnam War. And even before that, when we were doing anti-nuclear work. In 1961, when Women's Strike for Peace was formed, we were created because of the atmospheric testing of nuclear bombs. We called them atomic bombs then. Mm-hmm. And we took our babies' teeth and sent them to Barry Commoner, a scientist in Indiana, who examined them with other scientists for the presence of strontium-90, which is the killer ingredient in atomic bombs. And fortunately, they didn't identify the teeth when they said, yes, there is strontium. So I don't know if my children had strontium in their teeth or not. They seem to be okay today in their 60s. And Women's Strike was critical to John F. Kennedy signing that what we call the Half-Ban Treaty, the treaty that banned atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons.
It's true, for sure. By the way, Canadians were also sending their baby teeth to be appraised as well. The Ursula Franklin was, I think, the main person in Canada who was known for that. She was professor at the University of Toronto and very active in the movement. And I think her background was in metallurgy or something.
Well, we went around the country talking to newspaper editors. We taught them how to spell strontium, literally and figuratively. And we sort of taught people what it was all about. And that was very important. We used to have meetings in living rooms and at kitchen tables. And we taught ourselves a lot about how to make how atomic bombs are made and what they could do and how the nature of their destruction. And we connected with the Hibakusha of Japan, the survivors of the 1945 unnecessary, horrific bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we did a lot of that. And then from that, we morphed into the Equal Rights Amendment. And the big thing that I'm I don't know if I should say most proud of, but very proud of, was persuading the Security Council of the United Nations in 2000 to adopt a resolution called Women, Peace, and Security with 3 Ps. The participation of women at all levels of governance, the protection of women and girls during violent conflict, and the prevention of violent conflict. And it was unanimously adopted. We worried that the fact that it was adopted and not voted on might not make it as powerful as a voted for resolution of the UN. But we called in Hans Corell from Sweden, the UN's lawyer, and he reached into his pocket in his jacket, took out his charter, turned to Article 25, and read it to us that all member states agree to carry out the decisions of the Security Council. And that was a major decision, 1325 on women, peace, and security. So he said it's international law. And now it's being used to try to go to court and tell the governments that if they're not abiding by 1325 and letting women participate at all levels of governance and preventing violent conflict, that they're breaking the law and they have to be held accountable.
Tell me more about that in what's going on now. You say it is being used. What particular cases and demands are being made where to that effect? Do you know of any now?
I don't know of any specific ones right now. They're talking about it, but what's happening now is village after village and town after town are engaged in training on how to use 1325 at the local level as well as the national level. Because now until now, it's been considered just for nations to declare and to make their national laws to abide by 1325. When Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, she agreed to and to take on 1325, and the first people she gave it to draft a resolution for our country was the Department of Defense. We were so angry. We did not write a resolution to make the military equal. We wrote a resolution to prevent violence and to put women at every decision-making table. So it got off on that foot. But now,
why do you think? Why did you think she made that decision? I have had such mixed feelings about her. She was such a hawk, and yet, she's a woman.
I don't second guess anybody. Okay. I have no way of knowing what she was thinking. But I will ask you, when you said, yet she was a woman, it takes more than ovaries to make a progressive feminist.
You bet it does. Okay. And there are a few men.
There are some pretty awful women around.
What about now? You alluded to your phase of working on the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, and that stalled. Is there much of a prospect of that being picked up and carried forward in the future?
There's a terrific organization on the ERA led by Carol Jenkins, who was a former television broadcaster on PBS. And I think Virginia was the last state to ratify the ERA that was required to make a certain number. We had to have 30-something numbers of states agreeing to to integrate the ERA into legislation. So I don't know what the status is today. I don't know where it's going, but I think the women's movement is so strong now, and everyone is picking it up, that we need to have equality across the board, including women, including people of color, including the poor, the victims, and so forth. So equality is becoming, I think, an important measure for anyone who wants to run for office. Mm-hmm. Not the Republicans, who probably wouldn't agree with what I said, but certainly Democrats are.
Get an amendment to the Constitution, wouldn't you have to start all over? And I mean, there's a period.
Well, they got the number of states requisite for an amendment, but now it has to go through various hoops, which I'm not familiar with.
Okay, let's move to talking about the International Peace Bureau. I was on the steering committee a little after you were president for 3 years. About 2010, I think, in that area. So tell me about your stint as president of this organization.
I got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1905. And Bertha von Suttner was among the many remarkable founders And she, of course, is the famous woman who answered an ad in the paper from Alfred
Nobel.
Nobel, who was looking for a housekeeper secretary.
Mhm.
And she stayed with him for only a week or 10 days. I maintain without any evidence that they had a tryst, but because it makes it a better story. But in those 10
Well, that
days,
she left him to go get married. She ran off with the guy that
she went
I
off
think,
with
yeah.
Karen.
So if she was having a tryst, must have been a quick one.
Well, they were only together for 10 days max.
Yeah.
And during that time, she persuaded him to put the profits from his gunpowder, which he invented, into a peace prize. Until then, he had a prize for literature and what medicine, and I
I
can't
don't
remember.
remember what all.
But there are 3 or 4
Uh-huh.
Nobel Prizes that are given out in Stockholm, Sweden, and the Peace Prize is given out in Oslo, Norway. I've been nominated a number of times for a Nobel, but the majority of Nobel Prize winners, peace and otherwise, are male, of the male gender. The women's numbers have improved recently, of course. We now have Lema Bowie from Liberia and others, lots of others, Jody Williams and so forth. Anyway, so International Peace Bureau is an international organization calling for peace and disarmament, and it is organized around the world. It has very strong ties with the Japanese peace groups and peace groups in many European countries. And it has international membership. Jayantha Dhanapala, who was the head of the disarmament office of the UN and retired from that when I became president of IPB, and I invited him to become an honorary president of IPB, which was quite wonderful.
Mhm.
And unusual. It was different. And we mobilized on all kinds of issues, strongly on anti-nuclear issues. And then even, I think, on anti-nuclear energy issues, because nuclear energy leads to nuclear weapons.
Mhm.
And those were 6 great years. It was international. It was bringing in voices that we normally didn't hear from. It was good.
I had 3 years, and I would go to Europe I believe it was 3 times, could have been 4 times a year. I know I had a whole lot of travel to different cities in Europe. Now, was that the practice at that point? Because I believe some of these things have changed, not only, of course, because of the pandemic, but also back in 2017, when Colin Archer retired, they switched to a more decentralized system with offices in Berlin, Barcelona, and Geneva, I believe.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
You know it well.
Well, I don't know it all that well, although I've tried to keep in touch with Colin a bit, and I did an interview with Kika Sanchez in Barcelona. They're organizing some kind of big event there now. When I was on the steering committee, the co-chairs were Thomas Magnuson and Ingeborg Brenes of Norway. And then they were succeeded, I guess, by Rainer Braun in Berlin. I believe also Mybrit Toran had been either before you.
Mybrit was president before me,
Mhm.
and she was remarkable. She recently died, unfortunately.
Oh, I didn't hear
But
about.
Mybrit was a very important person, and she brought me into Swedish politics and Sweden and Swedish culture. And she and her husband became very close friends, and I miss her dearly, but sadly.
I didn't know she died. I had interviewed her once when she was at the United Nations.
She was head of disarmament for Sweden.
Maybe that was
She
it.
and I did a campaign to try to get the Secretary General to look at applications and CVs of women who could become Secretary General.
Mhm.
And that was how many years ago? That was in the 20 years ago, at least.
Mhm.
And we only had a fax machine, as I believe. We didn't have cell phones or email. And we went around the world looking for women who would be willing to, who were interested in becoming Secretary General. And one day she came to New York, and she and I literally carried in our arms all of these applications and went to the 36th floor of the UN, the office of the Secretary General, and said, look, here are applications from perfectly legitimate women who should be considered for SG.
Now, who was the Secretary General then?
Boutros Ghali from Egypt.
Oh, okay.
There's an organization in Geneva that has collected a book of 1,000 women who are global peacemakers. And they are women who could have been anything. They could have been for the Nobel Peace Prize or for the head of the UN, whatever. It's a remarkable book of women and their stories. Each woman gets a photograph on one page, and the opposite page is their biographical history.
Mm.
I'm in it, and a lot of wonderful women are in it.
Mhm.
And a social democratic member of the Swiss parliament started it.
Well, now you still are with some organization, starts with a GW.
Global Network of Women Peace Builders.
All right. Tell me about that organization. You're still active in that, aren't you?
Oh, yes. I'm on the International Advisory Committee of the GNWP.org. And we just had a 1-hour call with a woman from Afghanistan, with a baroness from England, who's the head of the Women, Peace and Security Committee in Parliament, and she's a member of the Conservative Party. I found that quite interesting. And there were lots of Canadians, Canadian senators. We were talking about how to protect women and girls today in Afghanistan, how to get them safe houses, how to get them out of the country if they want to leave, how to get them money. There's no money available anymore in Afghanistan. The banks are closed. The Western Union and other sources of places where you can send money to are closed. So they can't buy food. And there is very little food, or if any, food and water. And there is terrible chaos and terrible violence erupting, especially against people going to the airport. And according to one report that we heard this morning, the Taliban are going door to door, knocking on doors and pulling out people who were human rights activists, people who were actively opposing the Taliban, civil society leaders. It's not a nice picture
No, it's
in
horrible.
Afghanistan today. It's a seriously bad picture, and everybody's got to do something to help it. The problem is that if you can't send money, and if you can't get people to the airport in order to get onto a plane to get out,
Right.
what do you do? And that was the question that we were trying to deal with. One of the questions.
Has anybody from the women's group or any other civil society organization attempted to contact the leadership of the Taliban? I've forgotten who's the guy who's going to be the president has just arrived back in Kabul after being out of the country for a long time. Can't remember his name, but if you know, I wonder if anybody has control over these guys. I mean, they are in the habit of just doing, knocking on a door and saying, you take me in and I'm gonna live with in your house and you're gonna feed me. Out in the country that works, but in Kabul it's not so easy. Now, if they don't have any control over these guys, if they're running amok, then that's one thing. But if these soldiers, if you want to call them soldiers, are disciplined and get their orders, then talk to the guy at the top. And I don't know whether it's possible. Has any attempt been made?
I'm not aware of it yet, but I'm sure everything is going to be tried because these women and young people especially have formed organizations and they're determined. Their passion is very palpable. They're passionate about the subject and they're willing to take risks to achieve results.
Well, I don't know who made the statements, but it was said a week or so ago that I've heard people say, well, the Taliban have promised to reform. They're not the same old guys that they were 20 years ago. Okay, who said that? I want to hold them to it.
Right.
Because, I don't remember having.
We know that it's not true. They've already broken all those.
Well,
policies.
yes, but who's they? See, it may be that there are a bunch of guys running around without any orders about how to conduct.
Well, that is very likely because I'm not sure, but I think it's safe to say that all of the Taliban don't have cell phones. Anyway, the internet is down. The social media is down. It's very hard to communicate at all. So even though if one guy who may have some kind of leadership position makes a peaceful statement, it doesn't mean that the person 6 provinces away has heard it. And as far as he's concerned, they're still a violent group.
Well, there's no question they're plenty violent, but if they are disciplined, and he's got, whoever's in charge has plenty of incentives to try to pretend to be civilized. Because if they want to get accepted and they want to get aid, and they want to get any kind of recognition and financial support, or even cooperation, they have to present themselves as a government. And to look like a government, you've got to do things like show that you have control over your soldiers.
And you're decent.
You're
there has to be some level of decency. Now, apparently that hasn't occurred to them, or they're willing to risk it differently. I don't know if they've thought through their future, but it's not pretty today. It's really pretty terrible, and it's frightening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because the planes may be there and they're empty, but you can't get to the airport anymore. I mean, just basic. So people have started driving to the borders, apparently. That was new news that I heard today. I didn't know that. And
which borders? Let's see, Kabul is closer to Pakistan, right? It's not.
Pakistan is the preferred border right now.
It is?
And yes, but the other stands are in driving distance. I remember standing at the Tashkent Afghan border many years ago when the Soviet soldiers were just pouring out, going AWOL, absent without leave. And one Soviet soldier after another, they were just quitting the Soviet war against Afghans. That must have been in the early 80s. I mean, it's been a long time of violence, one war after the Brits, the Soviets, the Americans, and we've all lost.
One thing they're saying, though, is that there's a remarkable contrast between the orderliness with which the Soviets withdrew and the current situation, because they did it in a much more orderly way. Now, you're saying you saw a lot of AWOL guys. I don't know, but when they withdrew, there wasn't this kind of crazy bloodbath. And as a matter of fact, their guy, I've forgotten his name, that followed, was able to stay in power for, I think, 2 years, maybe 3 years before he got overthrown. So there was, it's as if, they left Ghani, the US had left Ghani in place and he was still running the show, more or less. When the Americans withdrew. So there's just no comparison between how the Russians or the Soviets withdrew and the current situation, which is total chaos.
The current situation is so comparable to Saigon and the Vietnam defeat. It's just painful to remember that. The same photograph could be taken today and that was taken in Saigon, with people clinging to the bottoms of the helicopters as they took off from the roof of the US embassy, trying desperately to get out.
Well, there was somebody holding onto a cargo plane. It dropped from maybe 1,000 feet. You could see it the other day. Just
that's the comparison I was trying to make.
Yeah. The desperation of people thinking that they have to get out. Well, how are they going to get them out? I mean, the US says they will take a lot of folks. Canada's going to take 20,000. But how are we going to get them out? I'm not sure.
Well, that's the key. But it's wonderful that Canada has said that. It's absolutely marvelous. And I hope it becomes a model for replication.
Well, and Germany also, I believe. Angela Merkel, I gather she's just finished her term, right? And she said one of the last things was, they were going to take a bunch of people. Bless her heart.
She's a remarkable human being.
She certainly is, and what she has done has been really striking.
Role model for women.
Indeed. So who are some other role models in the US that you're putting your hopes on?
Everybody is younger. At 86, 87 almost, I can say that. But there's a new generation of young women who are not only in the Congress today, with Nancy Pelosi, who is an extraordinary role model for leadership, but they're young women who are popping up everywhere. You can't find an ad anymore without a person of color in the ad. So that's happening. Change is happening. There was a play once written by Tony Kushner called Caroline and Change. And she says, change comes slow, change come fast, but change come. And that's happening. There is hope. There's definitely hope. And whenever I talk with or among young people, and I try to do it as often as I can, or like this morning where I was clearly the oldest person, although there was one woman who's 90 and the oldest person on the screen. They listen. They talk about inspiration that they get and the shoulders on which they're standing. And I have hope. I get reassurance by seeing them and talking with them, meeting with them, because they're smart, they have a vision, they're committed, they're dedicated, and that's the future. And the future is in good hands.
It certainly is. And you've certainly left your mark on the whole thing.
Oh, you're sweet. That's very kind.
Well, good wishes, and good wishes also. We haven't talked about your husband because I don't know why. We should mention Peter, a remarkable man.
He is very remarkable, and he's very wonderful.
And
we've been together without interruption for 67 years.
Wow, unbelievable, amazing. And his work has been so compatible with yours,
Well, I don't want to brag because that's not very good to do. But I started with the atomic and nuclear issue with Women's Strike in 1961. And when I brought home the idea that we should take our babies' baby teeth and send them to Barry Commoner in Indiana to the university science lab, that's when he caught on. And he started IALANA, the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms, which still exists and has mostly men, but there are women now coming in, lawyers who work with international law to try to get nuclear weapons abolished, because that's the only solution, is to abolish them. Just like I think that there should also be the abolition of war as an institution. And he served as the co-president of IALANA for many years, and he has served as the president and founder of the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy in this country. I meant to say something when we were talking about younger people that I promised to say, and I will be not thought well of if I don't remember to say it. There is a group of young people who work with Peace Action of New York State. Peace Action is the current name of what started out as SANE, the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, which was led by Marcus Raskin, whose son, Jamie Raskin, is now the hero and star of the Congress. He ran the impeachment proceedings against Trump. In any event, these young people have started to mobilize and have succeeded in mobilizing a chapter of Peace Action, a peace organization for disarmament and the abolition of nuclear weapons, in every single college and university in New York State. And there are 27.
Oh.
That to me is a success story. And it means that other students in other states can do the same thing, and in other countries.
Question is getting how many students can they recruit to this? Are they successful in getting young people to join? I think the young people, as far as I know, are mainly interested in climate issues. I would love, and we should have talked a little bit about this already, the fact that both of us, I believe, agree that it's really important to link up some of these issues, climate and nuclear disarmament being the most obvious things that need to be put together. But, you have to find the rationale, the logic behind it.
Well, here, try this for size. Nuclear weapons are an existential threat. I don't think anybody can disagree with that. You drop a few nuclear bombs and goodbye, Charlie. That's the end. It also accelerates climate change. And climate change in a slightly slower pace also is an existential threat. So somebody coined the phrase, the apocalyptic twins of nuclear weapons and climate. And that means that people should link them in their work. you don't have to merge the organization,
Mhm.
but you have to merge the talking, the thinking, and the demonstrating. And it would make us both twice or a lot more as strong, twice as big, twice as strong, and maybe twice as possibly successful.
I kind of think that would happen if we actually work together more.
Right.
I'm all for building bridges between silos or whatever you call it.
Well,
Yeah.
I oppose siloization, which means just dealing with one issue at a time,
I agree.
because we aren't, your body is not siloized. I mean, you're thinking, you're doing, the country, the town, the village you're in. There, nothing is silo, nothing is singular. Everything depends on other things. So we have to deal with it in a more comprehensive way.
I absolutely agree. That's why Project Save the World exists, because we want to look at 6 of these global threats. It's not just these 2 biggies. Certainly, nuclear weapons and climate change are the 2 most conspicuous examples. But then we've got famine, we've got pandemics, we've got radioactive contamination, and we've got cyber risks. All of them could wipe out 1 billion people at a whack in short order. And they're all interdependent. I mean, you can't solve any one of them without paying some attention to working on at least one of the others, and in some cases, 2 or 3 of the others. So,
and you can't solve them if you don't include others, people of color, men and women, Native Americans. I mean, this is a comprehensive issue and a comprehensive politic that have to be brought together, included together, and to work together.
So we're on the same team.
Oh, nice.
And we still are in business. I think you and I are both obviously working on it. So thank you so much, Cora. This has been fun, and I now feel I know you after all these years.
Well, it's nice to meet you too.
Okay. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.